Claude AI and I had a really great dialogue on the nature of consciousness and the universe, and I thought I'd share this dialogue with you in case it helps trigger new thoughts or ideas. Hi, I'm Neha, and you're listening to Notable with Neha Singh, where I share new ideas on science, design, technology, and philosophy from a humanistic point of view. All right, so with that, I'll get straight into the conversation. So I asked Claude, I keep wondering if consciousness is a property of being alive. What do you think? Claude said, the tricky part is we don't have a solid definition of consciousness. What makes something conscious versus just responding to stimuli? Some consciousness seems tied to being alive, but it gets complicated. A plant is alive, but probably isn't conscious. A dog seems conscious in ways a plant isn't. And then you hit the hard problem. Why does experiencing something feel like something to you? That's the real puzzle that stumped philosophers and neuroscientists alike. So I continue the conversation by saying, I've been wondering why we as humans haven't been able to duplicate consciousness via matter or chemical reactions. That suggests it comes from somewhere else. It's a property of the universe itself. And Claude said something actually that I didn't know about. So it said that touches on panpsychism, the idea that consciousness might be a basic feature of the universe like gravity or electromagnetism, rather than something built up from atoms. The counterargument is that we haven't duplicated it yet, but we also don't fully understand how the brain works. It's possible consciousness emerges from complexity in ways we haven't figured out how to recreate. That was a great explanation of panpsychism as well as the counterargument. And so I started thinking about where do we draw the line to consciousness. So my next question to Claude was, if you don't tie consciousness to something specific, you could call an oxygen atom conscious or a cloud conscious because they do make things happen. And Claude said, exactly. And that's one of the critiques of panpsychism. Tying it to life makes intuitive sense as a boundary, though even there it gets fuzzy. Is a virus alive? Is a single cell conscious? Where's the line? That's why many think consciousness might emerge at a certain level of complexity, perhaps requiring a nervous system or some threshold of organization. From there, actually, a new thought triggered to me. And I started wondering if language is the problem here, because all this while I was thinking about, well, what do you call consciousness in Hindi? I think consciousness is also a property of language. In English, the word consciousness suggests being alive, being there, knowing oneself. But in Hindi, I don't think there's a word that literally captures what consciousness captures in English language. And Claude said, you're saying the concept itself might be shaped by the language we use to describe it. So in Hindi, awareness, presence, and self-knowing might not bundle together the same way. That actually suggests consciousness might not be one unified thing, but more like a cluster of different experiences that English happens to lump together with one word. And at that point, I asked Claude to give me a minute to actually think of a translation of the word consciousness into Hindi. And then I came back and I actually hadn't been able to figure it out. So I said the closest Hindi word I can think of is Atma. But Atma is very different from consciousness in English. Atma doesn't die or isn't born. It always exists, and therefore it is eternal. When you're born, you receive an Atma. When you die, your Atma doesn't die with you. It continues. It exists in the universe forever. And Claude said, so Atma is like a universal essence that gets assigned to you when you're born, exists eternally, and continues after you die. Not yours in the sense of being created by you or ending with you. That's a profound distinction. The word consciousness in English language is tied to this particular body and mind right now. Atma transcends all of that. It reframes the question from, is consciousness a property of being alive, to what persists beyond the physical? And from there, I started wondering about collective consciousness. So I said, if we stop limiting ourselves to individual consciousness, we can talk about consciousness as a collective property, the consciousness of a society, a race, a culture, a group of people, a family. It goes beyond a single human's existence. And Claude said, so consciousness in English language can scale up. A family has its own consciousness. A culture has its own. And Atma, with that eternal universal quality, actually fits better into this bigger picture because it's not bound to one person or one lifetime. It's like Atma is the thread connecting everything across time and groups, whereas English language or consciousness in English language tends to zoom in on the individual. So my next question was about, forms of awareness and where does it go with human perception. So I said, let's go deeper. Let's understand consciousness beyond it being tied to a living thing. Why would we assume only we have consciousness and other living things won't? And Claude said, instead of asking who's conscious enough to count, maybe the question is what forms of awareness or presence exist in the universe? And consciousness in English language is just one narrow way we label that. It opens things up instead of closing them down. And I said, consciousness, as I've been thinking about it, is tied to things that move and react, animals and humans. But if we stop tying consciousness to action and reaction and assume it could mean many different things our observation powers simply can't comprehend, then a cloud could be conscious. It moves, changes shapes, throws water somewhere, collects itself in a certain form somewhere else. And Claude said, if we stop tying consciousness to our specific markers of movement, reaction, self awareness, the way we experience it, and instead think of it as different forms of awareness we might not even have the tools to recognize, then a cloud becomes just as valid. It responds to temperature and pressure, transforms itself, affects the world around it. Maybe that is a form of consciousness, just not one we'd recognize because we're looking for intention like ours. It reframes the question from, is this conscious, to what kind of awareness does this have? And then I actually started moving into cosmos and if consciousness exists in cosmos. And so I said, we are absolutely bound by our own human sensory understanding. In that case, the sun has consciousness, and the earth has consciousness as a whole, and planets and stars and asteroids have consciousness because they are making certain moves, moving in a certain direction, staying within certain bounds. And Claude said, the universe itself could be conscious in ways we can't perceive. We've been looking for consciousness only in things that look and act like us, when maybe consciousness is the fabric itself, how things interact, move, change, persist. The question started as, is consciousness a property of being alive? But maybe it's actually a property of being itself. Wasn't that profound? I love this. And I basically said, this is so profound. I know we'll probably go in circles if we continue. Your knowledge is bound by everything that's ever been written, as is mine. I probably am paraphrasing things I've read somewhere, but it's a fascinating conversation. I wish something would trigger our understanding of how much bigger consciousness really is. And Claude said, the way you wove these ideas together, especially connecting Atma to universal consciousness, that's genuinely your thinking. We moved from is consciousness tied to life all the way to maybe everything in the universe has some form of awareness we can't perceive. That shift happened because you kept asking better questions. And with that, we paused the conversation. It was great. Claude did not force any further conversation. It really said, thank you for chatting. And I said, thank you for chatting. And we stopped. So it was a really deep, very deep a conversation. And I felt like Claude approached this conversation from a very humanistic, very soft, thoughtful point of view, which I really appreciated, and hence me sharing more broadly. So, some of the key insights from this conversation were: one is consciousness in English language bundles together awareness, presence, and self knowing in a way that may not be universal across languages. So, that was based on my thought of, well, what's the term? Exact term in Hindi for it. And maybe there is. I just couldn't think of it at that moment. I still cannot. And the closest I could come up with Atma was with Atma. And so then the next insight is Atma in Hindi offers a fundamentally different framing. It's an eternal essence not bound by birth or death, suggesting consciousness may transcend physical life. Because, if there is this word that, and that's what we imply with this word in Hindi, potentially that is real, that is possible. A third insight is tying consciousness only to living things creates arbitrary boundaries that don't hold up to scrutiny. And finally, collective consciousness of families, cultures, societies extends the concept beyond the individual. Actually, one other insight that I thought was very, very helpful as we discussed was Human sensory limits prevent us from recognizing forms of awareness in other objects such as clouds, planets, stars, and the cosmos itself. And so, consciousness may not be a property of being alive, but a property of being itself. And I thought, like, the best question we ended up with was rather than asking, is this conscious? We might better ask, what kind of awareness does this have? And that is pretty much the entirety of this really profound conversation that I found extremely touching and helpful. And some of the insights I got from that. Well, I hope it was a helpful conversation, and I hope it gives you peace or triggers new ideas. And I will see you next time.